Quickly here, quoting Michael Parenti, businessmen collectively constitute the most class-conscious group in American society. As a class, they are more highly organized, more easily mobilized, have more facilities for communication, are more like-minded, and are more accustomed to stand together in defense of their privileges than any other group. And yet this is the group that depends on the consumption of our people. The ruling class is different from the subordinate classes, not only in terms of possessing more wealth. See, we like to think that rich people are rich only because they have more money. Watch that. And more power and more prestige. But more importantly, in terms of their ownership of the means of production and their concern with production and their desire to conserve, expand, and increase these factors. The rich own the means of production and concern themselves with maintaining that ownership and expanding that ownership and controlling that ownership. This is a very important difference between rich and poor. It's just not more money and less money. This ownership and these concerns on the part of the ruling group induces in them a class consciousness, a group solidarity and action orientation, markedly different from their lower class counterparts. Under capitalism, ruling class power and wealth is to a very significant degree founded on the consumerism of the subordinate classes, and consequently the subordinate classes must be socialized into consumerism, not socialized into production, but socialized into what? Consumption. This is why again and again I try to get across to people that one of the essences of an African-centered education is that the African-centered education is designed not to just see that you're better qualified to get jobs, to take advantage of opportunity offered by other people. You see, African-centered education rejects the market definition of why people are being educated in the first place. Because when we talk about making our children qualified and getting them prepared to take advantage of opportunities, we are also making the assumption that the opportunities that are being offered are not being offered by us. We are still assuming that the ownership of jobs and opportunity will be in the hands of other people. And I've asked people before, what makes you assume that the jobs will even be there? What makes you assume that whites will even offer you the job? Therefore, it is not enough for you to merely getting education, merely to read better, merely to go to the right schools. You are still making an assumption that those other people will offer you the jobs and give you the opportunities merely because you're qualified. And African-centered education involves itself then not with the mere qualification of our people and not with the mere preparation of them to take advantage of opportunities, but it must prepare them to create opportunities and to create jobs and to create ownership and to be productive, not consumers only. You see, that means then that African people have to achieve a whole different type of consciousness than is present today in our community. That is why I talk about African-centered education as having an intentionality, and it is that intentionality that transforms the education of black people. What do you intend to do? Not what has happened to you, not what you are missing, not the idea that your children are not reading as well or they're not doing math as well. That is not the stimulus for African-centered education. The stimulus for African-centered education is, what do we want as a people and how are we going to get it, and what are our intentions in the world? And how then are we going to educate our children so that those intentions can be fulfilled and actualized as a people? Because what did I tell you before? Colin Powell knows how to read well, and yet he uses his reading capacity to bomb and destroy black people. So it's not enough to teach them to read well. Other black mathematicians have worked on U.S. projects, nuclear research and bombs and so forth, so that they may be dropped on African populations. Ronald McNair and others were learned in physics. And what were they being used to do? To seed space with weapons so that the United States could intimidate African nations and destroy African nations from 400 and 500 miles out in space. It is not enough to get your children just to read well and know math well. They must read for a reason. They must read for an African reason and purpose. There must be an African intentionality involved in their learning to read and write and to do mathematics. If they are not being educated merely to make more money so that they can spend more money, you will never spend yourself out of oppression. As a matter of fact, again referring to the black-on-black violence, through our habits of consumption, we actually finance our oppression. Yes. We enrich our oppressors, increase their wealth, increase their power, and we create and maintain within ourselves a consciousness that maintains our oppression. We are so caught up in the consciousness of consumerism that we commit violence against one another in order to engage in consumer behavior. We sell poison to our children. We corrupt our communities. We disinvest the wealth of our communities. And we think that this is an expression of freedom, and this is an expression of wealth and status. And this means that since we consume equally to white folk, since we drive the same cars as white folk, live in the same houses, in the same neighborhood as white folk, we are the same as white folks, you are foolish. It is that very sameness that is maintaining the inequality. I was trying to explain to my class the other evening the confusion people have of equating sameness with equality. You want your children to have the same education as white children. Then if you do, you want them to stay oppressed. Yes. You don't want them to be educated in terms of their unique history. You don't want them to be educated in terms of their learning styles. You don't want them to be educated in terms of the problems they have to solve for themselves. You don't want them to be educated in terms of the reality of the fact that they are oppressed, not white children. No, you want them educated as if they were white children. That is the surest way to maintain oppression, to ignore one's reality and to be educated out of sync with one's reality. The black man today is being educated to solve white folks' problems and to get status when he solves their problem. Yes. And sees himself as successful when he solves a problem for them. And you still can't get that same one to work on a single problem in the black community. As a matter of fact, he's at a loss as to how to use his talents and knowledge in the interests of black folk. Speaking of individual definition, his job loses definition once it steps outside of the white context. His self-definition, which is tied to his job definition, is lost. I've told you before, black people even define intelligence in terms of solving problems for white folk. The consumerism of our people then, as stated by Parenti, the socialization of people into consumerism serves to retard class consciousness. By consumerism, I'm quoting Parenti here, I am referring to the tendency to treat consumption, the consumption and accumulation of goods and services as a central purpose of life. And consumption is no longer just a means to life, but a meaning for life itself. And we can see this in the statistics of black people. This endless comparison of black income with white income. What percentage of black people earning of white income? As if that is the most important index of black freedom. Not what percentage of America do black people own. What percentage of the means of production do black people own? What kind of military and other kind of power do black people own compared to white folk? No, that's not even dealt with. What income do you have compared with white folk? And as I've told you before, there's a difference between income and wealth. Because you may make $100,000 or $200,000 a year, does not mean that you're equally as wealthy as another person who may be having income of $100,000 or $200,000 because they own $10 million worth of property. The person is worth $10 million. You are worth your monthly salary. Why do not we then compare wealth and the ownership of real estate? Why do we merely compare what? Income, which to a good extent is an index of consumption, not an index of ownership, not an index of power, not an index of control. And yet we are given these statistics over and over again. And therefore we have a consciousness of people who concentrate on income instead of wealth, consumption instead of production. And then you want to think because you got a salary equal to white folk that you're equal as wealthy. You got another thought comment. Consumerism is more than an attitude arising from personal greed. It is a mode of social behavior functional to capitalistic society. The corporate need is to produce more, to sell more, to profit more, to produce more, and so on endlessly. Under capitalism, the acquisitive impulse is not merely indulged, it is constantly instigated and developed into a life imperative that cannot easily be put to rest. A psychology of moreness, knowing no end. In other words, once you get into this consumption mode, it's hard to get out of it. How many of you fighting your children about these Christmas gifts? And they've been pounded through the year, and now at this point, with all kinds of advertising. And this is another difference I have to talk about. When I was growing up, you know, you got what parents bought you. And the commercial market was pretty much projected toward adults. But now you have a commercial market that is highly segmented, that advertises not to adults only, but that advertises to specific segments in the society, all the way from older people. What do they spend? What are their habits? So you set this ad up this way if you want to get them. The mid-range, mid-age group, the adolescent, young adult group, what kind of music do they listen to? What kind of language do they use? What kind of taste do they have? So we want to set the ad up so that we can talk directly to them. But it doesn't stop only at adolescents. It talks about what? Children. Well, children from 4 to 5 or 5 to 10 are a $3 billion market. They are a market even though they're not working. They're not earning money, but they are a market because they know that these little kids can worry mom and daddy to death. And mom and daddy are going to do what? Buy those gifts. And therefore the little ads are directly shot, directly at them. They internalize them and express them in their attitudes and behavior toward their parents. And their parents are influenced by it, and the money goes out. And it's hard, once you get into it, to stop it. This is what we talk about. It becomes what? Imperative. You can't cut it off. It's like trying to cut off a smoking habit or something. Thus, the attention and energies of people in capitalist society becomes decidedly privatized. Consequently, while the socialization of the owning class members is designed to foster class loyalties and cohesions, the socialization of the propertyless move with opposite effect. And we can see it going in opposite direction. Thus, the development of the working class consciousness is retarded because all of them are caught up in their individual consumption and concern. And yet we're talking about businessmen, businesswomen, the corporate, group, the business establishment, but we hesitate to talk about groups of others on the lower level. Once again, we see that power is used not only to pursue interest, but to define interest, which is another power that the wealthy and the rich and the owners of production have that the consumer does not have. To define interest. Again, in Black on Black Violence, I talk about there in chapter 8, desiring production, of how tastes are created by the system, and how, in a sense, those things that we own as black people are devalued by the system, and only those things that have value are things owned by the other people. And their advertising establishment and their media creates a taste for everything that you don't have and that you can't make for yourself. That's the only way it can work. How did you gain the taste for what you have today?